Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are unpacking something absolutely massive. We're looking at a dense but completely fascinating piece of geopolitical theory from the legendary thinker Raymond Aron. We're going to explore how the invention of literally world-destroying weapons didn't just tweak military tactics, it fundamentally and kind of paradoxically wired our entire modern global order. Seriously, it's a wild journey into the psychology of superpowers, the actual meaning behind borders, and the terrifying logic that keeps the world spinning.
Okay, let's dive into this with a question that totally stumped the greatest military minds of the 20th century. For centuries, the classic rule, famously laid out by Karl von Clausewitz, was that war is the continuation of policy by other means. Basically, war was a tool, a horrific tool, sure, but a practical one used by states to get what they wanted. But what happens when that tool becomes so unimaginably powerful that it guarantees the absolute destruction of both the attacker and the defender? Did the atom bomb just shatter this fundamental rule of human history?
Well, Raymond Aron hit the nail on the head with this incredibly profound observation. He said, "For the first time, men are preparing a war they do not want, a war they hope not to wage." Think about that for a second. That is the ultimate paradox of the thermonuclear age. We're talking about nations pouring billions, trillions of dollars, and their absolute brightest scientific minds into building this devastating arsenal with the explicit goal of never ever actually using it. It's just a complete, total inversion of traditional military strategy.
To really unpack how this paradox actually works, here is our roadmap for today. We'll look at a new global system, one world deeply divided, the logic of blocks, global powers and regional conflicts, the future of the nation-state, and finally, the paradox of deterrence.
All right, Section 1, a new global system.
Right after the absolute devastation of the Second World War, humanity crossed a major threshold. We literally had to start viewing geopolitics not just on a national or even a continental level, but globally. Aron introduces this concept of the global system. He describes the international diplomatic universe as an echo chamber. And because of modern transport, instant communications, and weapons that can cross oceans in like 30 minutes, the barrier of physical distance, it's just erased. A conflict in a small Southeast Asian nation, or say a revolution in Latin America, it doesn't just stay local anymore. A disturbance at any single point on the planet instantly reverberates in Washington and Moscow and Beijing. It's all one giant interconnected web. And grasping this is absolutely crucial because it explains exactly why a local proxy war today can instantly threaten global markets and worldwide security.
Moving on to Section 2, one world deeply divided. So if we live in this hyper-interconnected system, how do we remain so violently fragmented? Well, Aron brilliantly illustrates the tension here. On one hand, we've got what he calls juridical homogeneity. That's basically the legal fiction we all shake hands on at the United Nations, the idea that every single state is entirely equal and sovereign. A country of just a few 100,000 people gets a flag, a seat, and a voice exactly like a country with 1 billion people. But on the flip side, we have to face the harsh material reality, which is real heterogeneity. Our supposedly unified world is actually defined by these vast, just staggering disparities in wealth, military power, population sizes, and political stability.
Which brings us to Section 3, the logic of blocks.
Because of these massive glaring disparities in power, the post-World War II world naturally organized itself into blocks. The formation of the US and Soviet spheres wasn't just some grand ideological crusade. It was really the mechanical effect of a bipolar equilibrium. When you have two superpowers emerge with overwhelming economic and nuclear might, smaller nations naturally gravitate, or let's be real, are pulled into their orbits just to survive. Now, to manage this incredible global reach, superpowers build these massive webs of alliances. But importantly, they aren't all created equal. Take Category 1 treaties, like NATO. That's the ultimate commitment. An attack on one is an attack on all. It carries the full, heavy weight of nuclear deterrence. Then you have Category 2 treaties, like CETO, which are consultative. Nations agree to act to meet a common danger, but they maintain freedom on how they actually act. And then Category 3 treaties, like the ones with Japan or South Korea, are much more about mutual defense and providing forward staging bases. This intricate, tiered web is exactly how a superpower projects deterrence across a fundamentally unequal world.
Let's move to Section 4, global powers, regional conflicts.
So what actually happens when we look past those massive global blocks? How do these giant superpower umbrellas interact with really volatile, specific regions? Well, the superpowers actually have to adapt to wildly different regional subsystems. They can't just slap one master template over the whole globe. In the Middle East, for instance, the dynamic is completely dictated by a really fragile equilibrium of local military forces. Over in Latin America, historical anti-Yankee sentiments and deep social crises were suddenly magnified and weaponized post-Cuba. And in parts of Africa, the whole dynamic shifts again. Diplomacy there often involves permanent discussion, and the superpowers have to navigate a landscape where deep-rooted tribal consciousness frequently prevails over the relatively newer concept of national unity.
Next up, Section 5, Future of the Nation-State.
Let's zoom in even further now, right down to the level of the individual nation-state. Historically, right, a state existed to physically protect its citizens behind a border. That was the whole deal. But today, if intercontinental ballistic missiles can fly over any wall in a matter of minutes, and if transnational ideologies can spread through global communication networks instantly, essentially making borders completely permeable, we really have to ask, is the territorial nation-state dead?
This entirely rewrites our understanding of modern sovereignty. Think about the classical territorial state. It was defined by being impenetrable. It had defensive borders, it had a total monopoly on internal force, you could literally keep the world out. The modern state, though, completely different beast. It is inherently permeable to outside ideologies. It's physically vulnerable to ballistic missiles launched from the other side of the planet, and for its ultimate survival, it's very often totally reliant on the nuclear umbrella of a much larger superpower. The very definition of what it means to be an independent country has just fundamentally changed.
And finally, Section 6, the paradox of deterrence.
Which brings us to the real climax of this explainer, the ultimate button that governs this entire fragile global architecture: deterrence. Aron defines the strategy of deterrence as preventing a virtual enemy from taking certain actions by threatening him with what one would detest doing. I mean, just stop and think about the psychological absurdity of that for a second. You are literally threatening to commit mutual suicide. You are promising to unleash an absolute apocalypse that will destroy your own nation just to ensure the other side doesn't take an inch of ground. It is frankly madness. And yet, unbelievably, it has been the absolute bedrock of global peace.
Aron breaks this down by mapping out 3 abstract models of how a nuclear exchange could theoretically play out. First, you have impunity from the crime. This is where the attacker strikes first, completely destroys the enemy's weapons, and escapes unharmed. Second, equality of crime and punishment. Both sides perfectly, simultaneously destroy each other in a pact of mutual suicide. And third, inequality of crime and punishment. Here, the attacker suffers less damage than the victim, but the damage they do take is still utterly devastating. So, the absolute crucial point here is understanding which of these models reflects our actual reality. Because if an attacker genuinely thinks they can achieve Model 1, or even just a highly favorable Model 3, man, the temptation to strike first grows very, very quickly. To make this dense game theory a bit more real, Aron uses this brilliantly chilling analogy. Imagine 2 gangsters locked in a room, both with their guns drawn. If one gangster believes he can shoot first and escape completely unharmed, that represents a highly vulnerable nuclear system. It practically invites a preemptive strike out of sheer, raw paranoia. You see, you don't strike because you actually want a war. You strike because you are absolutely terrified the other gangster is about to pull the trigger first. And that leaves us with one final really stark reality to ponder. We don't actually live in a world of perfect mutual destruction, and we certainly don't live in one of perfect impunity. We live in a messy, complicated world of unequal vulnerability. So, in a world governed by this inequality of crime and punishment, where a first strike might just mean less devastation rather than absolute survival, how long can this precarious balance of terror actually prevent the thermonuclear apocalypse? It's a sobering thought for sure, but it proves exactly why understanding the deep, structural mechanics of geopolitics is so absolutely crucial. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Until next time, keep questioning the world around you.